love to speak to, I'd love to speak to groups. As Beatrice mentioned, I teach at Columbia University and New York University, and we have a lot of international students from all over the world, including some from Colombia, some from Chile, some from Brazil. So welcome, and thank you for letting me speak with you today. So what I was asked to do is I was asked to talk to you about, particularly with regards to, go to the US strategy. And so that's what I'm going to focus in on. And then afterwards, we're going to get a chance to ask any questions, or I'll answer any questions for you. And just as a, I love to, just in a real American way, is sort of tell you what I'm going to tell you and then tell it to you, and then afterwards tell you what I just told you. So the agenda for today is first I'm going to do a little bit of just introduce myself, tell you a little bit about my book. And then within the book, there's several case studies. There was over a dozen case studies. So I picked out two that I'm going to be presenting to you, and then talk a little bit about understanding US customers, which is really the focus of marketing, and then give you some tools that you can use. I have a strategy exercise, although I was talking to Beatrice before, and I think maybe rather than doing that, what we'll do is that we'll just go to questions and answers. But that'll be up to you, but at least I'll show you some of the things, and those are some of the things that I teach as well. And the students there are graduate students, and they're, a lot of them want to be entrepreneurs and start their own companies or work for startup companies. So, well, first, let me tell you a little bit about me. So as I mentioned, I teach at Columbia and I teach at New York University, and I've been doing that for, I guess it's been about 7 or 8 years. And then before then, I worked at various companies in leadership roles, management and marketing companies, for companies like Bic, which makes pens and shavers, Chinette, Campbell Soup, Pitney Bowes, Snapple Beverages. Do you have Snapple down in Chile?
No, we don't.
You might have Sony Music, so that's, you get music, so that's so at least that. And then also, in addition to teaching, I also do consulting work. I've been working with several accelerator groups, and then do some private consulting, and some have been with international companies that wanted to come to the US, which is where I got the idea for the book, which is called Make It America: How International Companies and Entrepreneurs Can Successfully Enter and Scale in US Markets. And so it came out of that I had been doing some work with some international companies, and then I also did work with the European American Chamber of Commerce and a couple of the other Chamber of Commerce. And I recognized that, a lot of companies, like yourself, want to come to the US, but, it's difficult, and sort of there's a lot to know. And so it's a, very much in terms of an overview of things, whether it's the different locations, legal things that you need to know, financing, how to finance startups, HR, understanding Americans, and marketing. So it's sort of an overview, but it's still, you still need to talk to experts. And so certainly, speaking to legal experts, is important, but at least it'll give you an idea of the kinds of questions and the things that might to be on the lookout. It sort of is this idea about eyes wide open, going into a room with eyes wide open in terms of knowing, what you might encounter. So that was the idea of it. And as I mentioned, there are about over a dozen case studies in it, and I'm going to pick out two of them. There are none from Chile, but I have two Colombian companies, Alpina Foods, which is the dairy company, if you're familiar with them, and then Mediacom, which was a entrepreneur who came to the United States and started his own digital marketing agency that he sold to WPP, which is one of the largest advertising conglomerates in the world, for I think it was about 40 or 50 million dollars. And there are all sorts of different, and each case study sort of talks about a particular point, whether it's about financing, whether it's about HR issues. There's also some in there about visa issues as well. So that's just a little bit of about the book. And so I'm going to talk about, present two case studies. And both of these fit into this overall in terms of, you'll see is that marketing and understanding the market is really critical in both of these cases. So this is just a little bit of an input. But the first company is called Rocked, and it's an Australian company. It was founded in 2012, and it was started in Sydney, Australia. They decided, after they quickly proved out the R&D and proved out their solution, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. They moved to enter the US in 2014, and then the CEO, the founder, came to the US and then moved the headquarters to New York City in 2015. And then, as you'll see, is that, and I'll take you through it, but they've been incredibly successful, and that they're valued at nearly $2 billion. So what's that, a double unicorn? Maybe it's a unicorn with two little things coming out of their head. So a very successful company. And let me tell you about why they were successful. So the founder is a fellow named Bruce Buchanan. And so Bruce, previously, before starting Rocked, he had been the CEO of Jetstar Airlines, which is one of the first direct-to-consumer, D2C is direct-to-consumer airlines, and it was based in Europe and Singapore. I don't know if anyone's familiar with them, but so it's direct to consumer in the sense that people are buying directly online as opposed to going through travel agents and whatever. And they were one of the first ones to do that. And through that experience, he recognized the fact that e-commerce systems were really, none of them were really did the job right. And they're very complicated because there's a lot of third parties. You need to know the inventory systems. There's a lot of things that need to be optimized, as well as there are opportunities there with e-commerce to enhance the experience and then increase sales. And so they started out with this, their mission is to make e-commerce smarter, faster, and better. So the first lesson is the sense that they picked a huge market. And so the e-commerce market, it's like $4 trillion by 2025. And so it just keeps on going up. And then with COVID, that was also a huge increase in terms of the number of people that are shopping online, everything from fashion to food to toys, electronics, everything. And these are the ecosystem in the US of all of the players who are having e-commerce. Now, what drives all that e-commerce is the software behind it. And so the software behind e-commerce that allows people to do it, it's approximately a $6 billion category in 2020, and it's projected to grow 300% to 20 billion by 2028. So, within a short time. And so one of the first lessons, or the important thing in terms of starting a business, is that going after a huge market. And one of the things that you talk to investors or VCs, the first thing they want to know is what's the size of the market? What's the total potential? Because they're going to, that is sort of the limit or what potentially that they could be making. If it's a small market, even if you're 100% of a small market, you're only going to be able to capture a certain amount of revenue. But even if you're a small player within a huge market, that's something that they look for. And it's okay if you have competitors, as long as the market is really big. So that's the first lesson in terms of I wanted to impart. The second part of it is that the e-commerce is really complicated. I don't know if anyone here is involved in a startup or working in the e-commerce space, but you will know but it's extremely complicated. There's a lot of third-party transactions, and it keeps on changing. So there are always changes, is that, whether it's whoever is updating their software, you have to change yours. It's constantly changing. And then there's also a huge opportunity to improve it using artificial intelligence, and particularly in terms of being able to then maximize the sale opportunity once you have someone who's selling a product. And there's some statistic that 30% of all transactions never get completed. Someone starts the transaction, but then, for whatever reason, they get frustrated or whatever it is, then and so all of that is lost sales. So you have the lost sales from people who drop off, and then you have potentially lost opportunity sales for like offering them something else. That you just booked a ticket to go from Miami to New York. Oh, well, maybe you need to have a car, or need to have a hotel as addition. Those things, the upselling, are something that, AI can help to do it, and certainly more things. So getting back to Rocked, so they proved the concept. They did the R&D in Australia, and they proved the concept in Australia. And then they did a little bit in New Zealand and Singapore. And one of their clients was Ticketmaster. I don't know if you're familiar with Ticketmaster, but they're buying of concert tickets and athletic sporting events and things like that. And they were doing work with their Australian operation, and they said, well, we want you to come to the US. We're going to introduce you to our counterparts in the US. So they came to the US with already a starting of one of the largest companies in the e-commerce companies in the country. So that was, a really good start for them. And from they first did is that they looked at that, and they first focused in on entertainment and travel industry. So kind of the other lesson is that in terms of going after a market segment, a target that and you can do really well. And then once you do that, then you can expand to other categories. And, they do work with Staples, with Disney, they do with all sorts of different, companies. They've since expanded. And then the other thing I wanted to mention was the legal and finance. So along the way that they had, they first got $8 million was the first financing venture. Finally, it was a Series A's that they got in Australia in 2013. And then they did that with the intention, of then coming to the US. So they started the company, they got the money to go to expand to the US, and then they created a C corporation out of Delaware, because Delaware happens to have very favorable legal structure, and there's so many companies will incorporate in Delaware, even if they don't set up shop there. So they incorporated it into Delaware, and then later on, then they kept on getting additional money series, as they were growing, to fund their growth. And The latest one was just last year at the end of 2021, and for 325 million, which was a global. A lot of it was the lead investors were US investors, and that was where the almost $2 billion of finance of the market value came from. So I have a little clip to play. I hope I put this. Let me know if I think I put it on so that you can hear the sound. Let me know if you don't hear the sound of this. So this is a little bit about Rocked.
When people say it's impossible, it's like a red rag to a bull to me. It's like this challenge that just wells up this huge amount of passion and energy inside me, and I go, okay, game on.
Building is in Bruce's DNA. He took on the challenge of starting up a new airline and took those learnings and then brought them into Rocked.
When I started this business, a lot of people said, you'll never, ever solve this problem. This year, we passed the unicorn status.
We're growing at 120% plus this year, and that's really, really unusual.
Rocked's whole vision is how do we make e-commerce more human and focus in on what that customer actually wants to see.
Rocked's mastery of first-party data with their understanding of consumer intent and the technology have really driven ahead a lot of the personalization capability that they can provide.
The idea for Rocked came from the Jetstar time. We realized early on that there was this really important moment where consumers were on our website and they were transacting with us. And so we had to curate this experience. How many more communities could you service, and what new flights could you add, and how much of a game changer would this technology be?
Bruce's confidence comes from his mum.
My mum was this huge force. She would always ask questions. And so at a very young age, she always said, look, there'll be lots of other people in a classroom or a room that won't know the answer, but very few people will have the courage to actually go and ask the question. I surround myself with people that have a thirst for knowledge. While I was growing up, my dad would always be exploring. I've been through hikes where we've run out of water on the Australian outback. I've had storms where I've been on boats and I'm vomiting in my wet weather gear. And you realize when you get through those sorts of things that any sort of challenge actually helps you get centered. One of the things that I'm passionate about is finding people that have had to really struggle. They're the ones that actually can often step up and really surprise you.
Bruce's leadership style I would describe as refreshingly direct.
He's gonna challenge you to go further.
And when you look at the way that the team executes, there's truly this pattern of rowing in unison. Everyone's in the boat, pointed in the right direction, their oars are in the water together, and they're driving toward that shared vision of improving outcomes for e-commerce.
Rock music is part of who we are.
And because we were founded and born in Australia, there does tend to be a little bit of an Australian sensibility.
We have a work hard and play hard atmosphere.
I think fatherhood is one of those challenges. It's actually wonderful.
When we first met, I quickly discovered when he plays board games, and board games are a big part of our family, he would never let the kids win, no matter how little they were. And the fascinating thing is it actually does create honesty and integrity.
I'm an optimist and I'm a little bit stubborn. I'm sure if you ask Elizabeth, she'll tell you I'm a lot stubborn, but I think most entrepreneurs have to be optimistic because you have to be able to see something that hasn't been created in a world where you can see it will be created. I get really passionate about solving those sorts of problems that people said can't be solved. So the tougher the problem, the more energy and more excitement I get every morning.
Okay, so the takeaways from this case study is a lesson. So in the book, every case study has lessons to be learned. And the ones that came from this, were really few. And the first one is that the market size really matters, going after a large market. Solving an important problem, that's another key in terms of, from a marketing perspective. Targeting specific markets, the fact that they first went in with something that they knew, which was the ticketing, the travel and entertainment, and then also fully committing to the US. Bruce came over here, he built a team, and then he moved the operation quickly. So it was, and he said that that was critical to be able to then address the market, and he saw the US as really being the key for him to both become this double unicorn because of its size and because of the huge number of e-commerce customers that are here. So I'll go on to the next one, unless there are any questions. Are there any? I'm gonna take a quick look at the chat.
No questions yet.
Okay. Okay, good. Terrific. Okay, so that was a good one, right? So that was a very successful. So now I'm going to tell you another case study about a company that wasn't so successful, and that this company is that Menk Fenster, and Fenster means window in German. And so I'm going to share with you. So Menk Fenster was a 130-year-old manufacturer of windows and doors, and they had been selling to the US primarily through distributors. So they had been coming here. And then in 2015, they said, well, the US market is such a huge potential, let's get serious and let's expand in a much greater way to the US. So they formed a joint venture with another German company, a Liesenfeld International, which is like a logistics company. And then they formed a US subsidiary, or actually it was a joint venture, it wasn't a subsidiary, called Menk USA in 2015. And they went to Western Massachusetts, which is about 2 hours from where Beatrice and Fernanda are, in Chicopee, Massachusetts. And then they opened up a factory. They created a factory in a building there. And they had received close to a little over $1 million in incentives from the state and the city to get incentives in terms of tax. They also received $5 million in a tax-exempt bond from the State Economic Development Organization. And they proceeded to go out and build what they call the factory of the future. And that they built this high-tech factory in Western Massachusetts. And it was, I don't know if you know anything about building windows, but they're incredibly precise. It really requires real precision and advanced equipment in order to do it. And as the president or the CEO said, that window and door innovation is 10 years more advanced in Europe than it is in the US. And that they're going to use that same manufacturing advanced energy efficient requirements and manufacturing processes that are in Europe and bring that to the United States. So as I had mentioned, they've closed the factory 2 years later and left the US market. And according to one of the investors, this Boston private who had funded the bond, they said the sales were too slow. The factory took too long to set up. It was more expensive to manufacture than they had thought. And the investors said, we're not going to give you any more money. We don't see a return on the investment. So the question I'm going to pose to the group is, what do you think went wrong for Menk? Any thoughts? Well, let me tell you, I don't know if there's anything in the chat. Is there anything in the chat?
Planning, maybe?
Excuse me?
Planning, maybe?
Well, yeah, planning was certainly part of it. Yeah, definitely. But let me tell you a little bit about what went wrong. So in Europe, they use windows which are called tilt and turn windows, right? Where you turn them and tilt them into the United States, into the room, right? So that's what is the majority of windows that are, I'm not sure in terms of South America, but here in the US, we do casement windows where it folds out and goes outside. It doesn't come in, or we use double hung windows. So there is a small percentage in some office buildings and some really fine where they're using the European style, but they didn't see that in terms of the so there, and you had mentioned projection planning, so their projections were way off because of, they were not making the right kind of windows. In addition, and this is a little bit different today than it is back in 2017, but from an energy perspective, so the energy prices were about twice as much in Europe than they are in the United States. So whereas they were making these highly energy efficient windows that, were save money because of its efficiency, but the problem is that they cost more than twice as much. And so for the US, in order to pay back, because the energy costs weren't as much, it would take much longer in terms of pay back that investment. So Americans were saying, well, it doesn't financially make sense for us to invest in this highly energy efficient windows. Now, there is certainly a segment of the market where doing things from an energy perspective was more because something that they wanted to do, but it wasn't, at least at that time, it wasn't an economic requirement. And in fact, that it was, so that people were, so kind of the lessons, as someone had said, planning is that they never investigated in terms of, well, what was that market potential? What was the market size in terms of, they looked at the overall window market, but they never really looked at, okay, well, what's the percentage for these twist and turn windows? And they never really learned what US customers wanted. They didn't go through that. And then the other thing that worked in their disfavor is in terms of the timing. So they were coming in sort of right after we had a credit crisis, which was in 2008, 2009, which then took a while for the housing market to then recoup. So they came in really at the wrong time, because later, like now, housing is booming. So that was something. And then the other part of the story, which I didn't mention before, was in order to operate all of those really high-tech, expensive million-dollar pieces of equipment, you really needed expert talent. And so where they located in Western Massachusetts, there wasn't a pool of highly trained, highly skilled talent that would be able to then run their expensive, really complex computer controlled equipment. And so what they had to do is they had to teach people, and it took them a lot longer to teach them how to do it. So those are sort of some of the reasons. So you have, two case studies that I presented. One was a success and another one was a failure. And both of them, in my view, are because of marketing. And by marketing, in terms of not understanding, in the case of Rocked, they really understood what their customer, their e-commerce customer wanted and needed, and they really helped them moving forward. Where in the case of Mank, they didn't understand what their customer. And so that's a critical thing. And, I come from that perspective. And for me, I think that's the most important thing. And you often will hear about the term product market fit. That's a term that's familiar, but that's something that's really important. And this is a case where one company got that product market fit right, and then the other one didn't. So unless there are any questions, I'm going to move forward. Any questions from the group? Okay. So so then we talked about
I
sort of.
have one question,
Sure.
Matthew. How come they came to the US with somebody somebody was with them working, some other company. So
Which
how
one? The
come
window company?
yes, the window company.
Well, they had
You
some
know-
distributors. They have been selling in the US, some, they had been doing some with some distributors, but it was two German companies that came to the US by themselves.
Oh,
I think they hired an American, but for the most part, the management was German.
okay. Okay.
So, but I think you're right, is that, having
They
a
didn't have
local,
enough feedback from the distributor company before they came, right?
yeah, and really understanding, and that sort of gets in terms of, well, how do you understand customers, right? And so it's really, and that's, kind of an art in terms of understanding, who they are. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then the first part is you have to ask the question, well, who is the customer, right? And so having and developing a customer-centric strategy. Roger Martin is sort of was the dean of the Rotman School of Business, and to talk about customer-centered strategy is critical. But who is the customer, right? And so that's important in terms of, it's a simple question, but sometimes it's not that simple. So in this particular case, let's say you're selling dairy products or ice cream. Is the customer the person who's eating it? Well, they're the consumer of it, but they aren't necessarily the purchaser, right? The customer of that particular thing, it's going to be the shopper, whether the mother or the father, or someone who's actually buying the product. But then also another of the customer is that, well, the retailer. The retailer is also a customer in the sense that you have to then make sure that you get distribution, into that store. So in a consumer product companies, you've got those multiple layers. It's even more complicated when you're selling business to business products. So in a business to business products, you'd often, let's say if you have a software solution, you'd have the user who's the user of the software solution or whatever it is. So there you have the user, but then also in a business to business, you also have the people who are the approvers, the approver of, whether it's a lot of times we have procurement departments or people who are purchasing for the company. And so that's someone in terms of they're ones who approve the purchase. And then also you'd also have a budget owner. And often you'll have three different people or three different groups that need to get buy-in in order for you to sell the product. So it gets kind of complicated in terms of, understanding. So one of the first questions you need to ask, well, who is your product, your brand? Who is it, the customers, and who are the people that we need to then influence? So I'm going to talk about, some tools. I'm not going to spend a lot of time because we're a little bit short on time, but I'm going to talk about some of the tools that we use. I'm in the marketing consulting business, and what we do work with companies in terms of some of the tools to try to uncover some of these things and to really to get to know who those customers are. And so, understanding is sort of, getting their perspective, understanding and looking from their perspective, knowing their language. What is how do they talk about something? What are the requirements? What are the things that they talk about? That's really important. And every industry is different. Understanding what motivates them. What are the things that, is going to make them make the purchase or want to try something? And then also important is to understanding, well, what are their pains? What are their problems? In the case of Bruce with Rocked, he really understood the pain and the problem of, an inefficient ticketing system, as people were trying to purchase tickets on their e-commerce system. He really saw the pain, and then he then proceeded to then be able to solve their problems. So some of the tools that we use is that, you might be familiar with some of these, but customer personas, where you try to create a picture of what the customer is like. We do this a lot, particularly as we're develop websites and create websites for that customer. Creating something called empathy maps to try to get an understanding, looking at the customer journey. How are they, what are their steps that they take, and then looking at ways that you could then influence, at different parts. So then also, another one I look at is that, what are the jobs to be done? So let me just give you a quick brief of them, and then we'll go on to the question and answer. So personas is the typical, sort of putting together, sort of an idea of like almost, who is the person, and trying to get who that audience is, and really understanding, well, what are some of the headaches? What are some of the things that they go through? Whatever you can do to sort of dimensionalize. So if you're think of it as having a conversation with someone, the more you know them, the more you can have and relate to them and connect to them. So personas to help to do that. Another one that I use a lot, which I like a lot, is sort of an empathy map, where you try to say, okay, here's the person, what are the things that they think or they feel? What do they hear? What are the things that they say or they do and see? And so let me show you. So at one point in my career, I was head of marketing, head of brand, actually the whole brand management for a company, BIC, which makes shavers, pens and shavers. And when I was in charge of the shaver division, our core target were men who were between 21 and 30. That was the bulk of our customers. And so we did is we said, okay, well, what do they think and they feel? What do they hear? And, what do they say? And so really get to try to understand, what are the things that sort of, how do we appeal to them? And they see various things in terms of careers, and appearance is important, but shaving is really this task that they really don't like to do. But the more that we could get in, and then that helped us in terms of developing both communications and programs, and actually products. At one point I found out that about 30% of all men in the US felt that they have heavy or tough beards. So I actually came up with a shaver called BIC Tough Beard. And it was designed specifically for men who have heavy or tough beards. And people said, well, if you designed that specifically for me, it probably, does the job that I needed to do. And 75% of the people that we had interviewed in research said, well, I would give it a try. I have a heavy or tough beard. So those people that did it. So the more you can understand the customer, and these are sort of just techniques or tools that we use in order to then be able to do it. And another one is sort of, the jobs to be done is to thinking about, well, what is the job, in the case of as I mentioned, the shaver, what was the job that shaver needed to do in order to why people were buying it. And so those were, sort of helps you in terms of putting that together. And then one of the things is sort of it's a whole practice of learning your jobs to be done, but an ideal strategy or positioning, if you can come up with something that's better and then less expensive, is that getting a job done. And as an example of that, if you look at Uber, if you're familiar with Uber, but the ride sharing service, so they have several different types of services. Their core one, or their base one, is Uber X. I don't know why they call it that, but Uber X, but they're charging less than you would get for taking a cab or a taxi service. And it gets the job done better and it costs less. So that's their ideal position. But then they also have something where they're charging more for a luxury, they have an Uber X where they show up with a limousine or an extra large car. They're able to charge more money because the job that it's being done is as to whether it's to impress someone with a limousine, or if you have a big load that you need to carry, you can have an extra large, and people are willing to spend more because the job that they need to do requires a different type of vehicle, a different type of service. Or you could do ride sharing where you have with a pool of other people, and then you can get your you can get travel to wherever you need to. It's not quite as convenient because you're sharing it with other people, and you have to drop off for them, and it's not quite as comfortable, but it costs less. But that strategy is in terms of attractive because they're charging less, and there's a certain group of people that will make that decision because they'd rather spend less money than to pay extra for the service. And then the last one, I'm not going to go into it, but looking at the journey. So if you think about the various steps that someone has in terms of the purchasing decision, and that often we'll put together these, what we call a journey map. We're looking at the stages of where someone just gets the idea for buying a product or needing a service. They become aware of what are the options that are out there. They look at various considerations, they make a decision, and sort of understanding how they go through that process is a way of sort of, we look at what are the problems that are happening or what are the opportunities, and that gives you a way of either providing information, targeting marketing. I did one project with, it was a pet insurance company, and we looked at the journey, and we were giving, reaching people at different stages of the journey. As someone was just getting a new puppy, we provided them with information about, how do you train a new puppy and congratulations and various things. Whereas later in the journey, as the dog was getting older and getting towards the end of the life, was providing them with different information, and it was a totally different message and marketing that we provided them with. So sometimes I'm not going to do this today, but with other groups that I've done, and particularly, some of the workshops that I've given, where we do a strategy exercise where we look at a particular product and then identify different types of people that might be buyers or purchasers of that particular, in this particular case, cybersecurity software. Maybe someone who's the president of a company or a salesperson or whatever, and then, put together an empathy map for doing that. But I think for the time, because I went a little bit long and I want to make sure to give you guys opportunity for questions, why don't we just kind of go to the questions and answers?
There's some questions in the chat.
Okay.
So it says, given that and what you said about coming to the US and making some mistakes if they did not come and study the market beforehand, they say, given that, should we hire at the very least our sales and support teams in the USA?
Well, there's no yes or no answer. I think that every situation is different, but certainly having that, I've seen cases where hiring of someone who's a foreign national who's been here and spent a lot of time in the US that understands is something that has worked. But there is, has to have that sort of deep understanding of both the American consumers, the process here, the language. I've seen cases where particularly people in Britain, in the UK, try to bring in materials, marketing materials that was written for Britain, and think, well, because it's in English, it'll work here, and it doesn't work here. So yeah, so I don't know if does that answer the question, but I think generally you need to get that market knowledge. How you get it is really, there are various ways to do that.
Okay, I'm gonna now pass. So Jose Miguel Carrasco has his hand up, and then we can read more questions on the chat.
Sure.
Jose Miguel, dale.
Okay, I have a small or not so small question is, what do you think of the major challenges for the Latin America culture, business culture in the USA?
Let me just repeat that. What was the major?
Main challenges that Latin American companies have when entering the US market?
No, I mean the business culture, not the companies by themselves. You know, the way we think business and apply business here in Latin America is different than how business is made in USA. So what are the major challenges? What do we have to change out of our service when we are facing, or we are facing American competition or American?
Yeah, I think that it's really, and there's a chapter in my book that goes into really understanding and looking at sort of the differences of culture. But there are some cultural differences, and I think that it's an understanding of that. But the good news is that Americans, for the most part, are very welcoming, and we do like people from all over. Despite what you might be hearing about America first and whatever, overwhelmingly we're very welcoming in terms of people from other culture, and we like diversity. We're incredibly diverse, so I think that there's it's just an opportunity, and I think it's just a matter of really understanding and just not taking for granted that things might work in one country that doesn't work in another one. I know Fernanda and I were talking about some things about just in terms of how you give a presentation. The American way is that what we'll do is what we'll give you okay, here's the conclusion, and then we'll back it up with okay, well, here are the things or the details or how we got there. Whereas in other cultures, I know we were talking about some of the Latin American countries and Chile, as well as in some European countries, it's sort of building up. We're starting with, here are all of the scientific facts, here are all the things. And then at the very end, then it's, because of this, here's our conclusion. So whereas an American, well, we just want to get right to it. We tell us what we need. And then we might ask you questions afterwards, but, don't take an hour to, build up to the story. Fernanda, did I get that right?
Absolutely. I think that's the best summary of what I always tell all our entrepreneurs. Start with the very specific, what are you doing? What is your product? What is your service? Because many times we tend in Latin American culture to start explaining in a very long way and very maybe circular. To end with the conclusion. And here in the US, you need to start with the what is the product and service, and then you can start explaining and then finishing up again with the conclusion. So yeah, I completely agree with that.
So Jorge Ordillo has his hand up, and then we're just gonna go first with the people with the hand up and then read the ones in the chat.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you so much. We have developed a digital version of Costco Wholesale Club, and we have set all our marketing based on American price-conscious buyer segmentation, reaching them through a B2B2C strategy. What would you suggest us for a soft landing process in Massachusetts?
What would be a process?
Yeah, a soft landing, as a soft landing for us.
I'm not really sure. I think that working with one of the accelerators, or sort of putting a toe in the water, and then would probably be, a good start. And probably, I think that, the idea of test, learn, refine, test, learn, refine, and sort of viewing that type of an approach would probably be the recommendation. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, mostly. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. One of the questions was, I guess Alvaro is a little confused about the German company story, because if they were successfully selling earlier in the US market through a distributor, that means that the product market fit was right. So why do they found so many surprises once installed in the US? At least in terms of product and price fit, it doesn't make sense.
Well, because the US market is huge. So we're the largest economy in the world. And so there's always going to be, some segments. And so there is a segment of the market that's making, that is buying very high-end windows that are wooden, that are making, let's say it's a renovation. I know that one of the universities in Massachusetts was doing a extremely, expensive renovation of their library using the finest and the ingredients. So it's just always going to be a customer for something, but it was more of they just misjudged the size of the market. So there's always going to be, so that segment of the market for those fine wooden tilt, turn and tilt, there is a small segment, but it's not anywhere near the huge overall window market. So there was a small, they were able to capture a small amount, but it was just they misjudged their growth rate.
Okay, and another question is there any source of information you can recommend to us in order to start doing our homework to understand better the US market? Could be a plug for your book.
Yeah. Yeah, there's some really good sources. Actually, the US government has a lot of really good sources. There's a website called I think it's called US Facts. And then also the US government has a real tremendous amount of information, of databases about sizes, about markets, about industry. So there's a lot of published information in terms of numbers. So that would be a good start. And then, yeah, so that would be the first place that I would start.
Okay, I think that's it for the questions, unless somebody else has another question they want to ask now. It's your chance. Oh, should we hire at the very least our sales and support teams in the US when starting? Okay, I already read that. And Matthew said he can't really come down with what you should or shouldn't do regarding that.
Yeah, but I think for the most part, I think that hiring talent, like even the case with Rocked, they've had the R&D was in Australia, and they brought over some of the people who were management and folks, but then for the most part, they hired all of their customer service people and their sales people were all people that they hired in the United States. And I think the marketing people too. So
I think then that would be it regarding the questions. Do you have any closing statements, Matthew? And then we can close this webinar and session.
No, I just wanted to my contact information, and you're welcome to take a screen grab of this. So I do have do some consulting work, through my Rocket Market Development. Or also I encourage you to, connect with me on LinkedIn. You're welcome to do that. My phone number is here, as well as the book. And then if you go to the site for the book is matthewleesawyer.com. And it's available for pre-order today.
Thank you so much, Matthew.
My
I
pleasure.
hope somebody got the screen. If not, we can send it through the chat. And thank you for having this presentation and imparting your knowledge to us and our teams. And thank you for all the teams who are here and participate in this webinar. So having said all of this, enjoy your evening, everyone. Goodbye.
Terrific. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for your time.
Bye-bye.
Charlie, voy a cerrar la sesión.